Some places do not disappear because of time. They disappear because the sea decides to keep their secrets. The fog rolled across Blackwater Bay like a living thing that night, thick and pale beneath the harbor lights, swallowing the docks one by one until the shoreline looked less like a town and more like the edge of another world. The wind carried the smell of salt, diesel fuel, and cold rain drifting in from the Atlantic, while somewhere beyond the mist, waves struck the rocks with the slow rhythm of a sleeping giant breathing beneath the dark. Caleb Mercer sat behind the wheel of his battered Ford pickup near Pier 9, one gloved hand resting against the cracked steering wheel while the other absently scratched the neck of the German shepherd beside him. Bruno lifted his head slightly, amber eyes reflecting the pale harbor lamps outside the windshield. At 6 years old, the shepherd still carried the posture of a working military dog, alert even in silence, ears twitching toward sounds no human could hear yet. Caleb understood that look. After years overseas as an army combat engineer, he had learned to trust the moments when silence suddenly felt different. The dashboard clock glowed 2:11 a.m. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Most of the harbor had gone dark hours ago except for Murphy's Crab Shack near the marina entrance and the old lighthouse standing farther north beyond the abandoned docks. Caleb had arrived in Blackwater only 3 days earlier searching for temporary work repairing fishing boats before winter tightened its grip on the coast. He did not plan on staying long. Men like him rarely stayed anywhere long anymore. The harbor town seemed worn down by years of storms and shrinking fishing seasons. Paint peeled from old bait shops. Rust-covered anchor chains. Even the gulls sounded lonely circling above the empty marina. Yet something about Blackwater felt heavier than ordinary poverty. The town carried the silence of a place trying not to remember something. Bruno suddenly stiffened. His ears shot forward toward the fog beyond the truck. A low rumble rolled from his chest. Caleb turned slowly. "What is it, boy?" Then it came. A bell. Deep. Hollow. Somewhere far out on the water. One long metallic toll drifting through the mist. Caleb frowned. The harbor master had told him no ships entered Blackwater after midnight because the northern channel had become too dangerous decades ago. Another bell echoed across the bay. Bruno rose instantly onto all fours. Then 3 sharp barks exploded from him in rapid succession. Caleb's pulse tightened. That bark pattern meant danger. Always danger. Bruno lunged toward the passenger door before Caleb could grab the leash. Easy. But the shepherd was already clawing at the handle, staring toward the northern pier disappearing beneath the fog. Then Caleb heard it. A voice. Faint. Carried by the wind. Someone shouting for help. He shoved open the truck door and the cold air hit him like seawater against bare skin. Bruno bolted ahead through the mist, paws hammering across the wet pavement while Caleb sprinted behind him toward the old docks. Harbor lights flickered weakly overhead as the fog thickened around them. The wooden boards beneath Caleb's boots groaned with moisture and age. Somewhere ahead came another desperate cry followed by the violent creak of timber shifting against the tide. Caleb rounded the final bend near the abandoned northern pier and froze. An old man clung to the railing at the far end of the dock while waves crashed beneath him. Part of the pier had already collapsed into the black water below. The remaining boards bent dangerously with every strike of the tide. Bruno stood near the edge barking furiously into the storm while the old fisherman struggled to hold himself upright against the screaming wind. Then Caleb noticed something else beyond the shattered pier. Out in the fog where no vessel should have been, a dim golden light moved slowly across the water like the lantern of a ship that no longer belonged to this world. The dock groaned beneath Caleb's boots as another wave slammed against the pilings below, spraying icy saltwater through the gaps in the rotting boards. The old fisherman clung to the railing with trembling hands while the fog swirled around him in pale ribbons that looked almost alive beneath the harbor. Lamps. Bruno stood low near the edge, barking into the darkness beyond the pier instead of at the man himself, as if something farther out on the water held the dog's full attention. "Do not move, Caleb shouted over the wind as he grabbed a coil of rope hanging from an old lobster crate nearby. The fisherman tried to answer, but another violent creak rolled through the pier before his words vanished into the storm. Caleb moved carefully across the soaked boards, testing each step the same way he once crossed damaged bridges overseas. The wood bent under his weight. Nails squealed. Somewhere below, seawater surged through broken support beams with the hollow sound of a cave breathing in the dark. The old man's gray wool coat whipped violently in the wind. He looked to be in his late 70s, tall but thinned by age and hard weather, with a deeply lined face that carried the rough texture of a lifetime spent beneath salt air and winter storms. His beard was white and damp from the mist, and his pale blue eyes held the exhausted look of someone who had spent too many years listening to lonely water. Caleb secured the rope around an iron post and reached the final stretch of broken dock just as another plank snapped loose into the tide below. Bruno barked sharply again. 3 times. The same warning pattern. Caleb glanced toward the black water beyond the harbor. The golden light was still there. Moving slowly through the fog. Too low to be a helicopter. Too steady to be a fishing boat. For a moment it looked almost suspended above the sea itself. "Sir," Caleb called, forcing his attention back. "Take my hand." The fisherman stared past him toward the distant glow with an expression that tightened Caleb's chest. Fear. Not surprise. Not confusion. Recognition. Then the old man whispered something almost lost beneath the wind. It came back. Caleb reached him seconds before another section of railing cracked apart. He wrapped an arm around the fisherman's shoulders and guided him carefully across the shifting boards while Bruno paced beside them, paws splashing through shallow rainwater pooling across the pier. The shepherd never once looked away from the fog. Offshore. By the time they reached solid ground, the old man was breathing hard from cold and exhaustion. Caleb led him toward the pickup truck while rain hissed softly across the harbor pavement. Bruno jumped into the back seat first but remained standing, ears high, eyes fixed through the rear window toward the water. Caleb turned the heater on full blast. Warm air rattled through the vents carrying the dusty smell of old fabric and engine oil. The fisherman sat silently for several moments, staring at his weathered hands before finally speaking. Most people in this town stopped going near the North Pier after midnight. His voice sounded rough like driftwood rubbed smooth by years of tide. Caleb handed him an old blanket from behind the seat. Why? The fisherman hesitated. Outside, the fog thickened against the windows until the harbor lights became blurred halos floating in darkness. Somewhere far beyond the marina, the bell rang again. One deep hollow toll rolling across the bay. Bruno let out a low growl. The old man closed his eyes briefly. Because sometimes, he whispered, the sea remembers what men tried to bury. Caleb felt the air inside the truck suddenly grow colder despite the heater humming beneath the dashboard. Then the fisherman slowly turned toward him and extended a shaking hand. "Walter Hale," he said quietly. "And if that light returned tonight after 60 years, then something beneath Blackwater Harbor has finally decided to wake up." Rain drifted softly across the harbor as Caleb guided the truck through the sleeping streets of Blackwater Bay, the windshield wipers sweeping back and forth with a tired rhythm that matched the sound of distant waves striking the seawall. Most of the town had vanished into darkness except for a few dim porch lights glowing through the fog like candles left burning for souls still trying to find their way home. Walter Hale sat silently in the passenger seat wrapped in the wool blanket, his weathered hands resting against his knees while drops of seawater slowly darkened the fabric beneath him. Bruno remained standing in the back seat, eyes fixed through the rear glass toward the harbor behind them. Every few seconds his ears twitched toward sounds that Caleb still could not hear. The old fisherman finally pointed toward a narrow road climbing along the cliffs north of town. "Take Harbor Lane," he said quietly. "Last house before the lighthouse." Caleb nodded and turned uphill. The truck climbed through curling fog that drifted between the cedar trees lining the road. Branches scraped softly against the sides of the vehicle while somewhere below, hidden beneath the cliffs, the ocean breathed against black stone. The farther they drove, the quieter the world became. Even the wind seemed careful here. Walter's cottage appeared suddenly through the mist like something preserved from another century. It sat alone above the sea on a rocky bluff overlooking the harbor, weathered cedar shingles silvered by salt and time. A small lantern glowed beside the front porch, casting warm amber light across old fishing nets hanging from wooden hooks beneath the eaves. The house smelled faintly of cedar smoke, black coffee, and seawater the moment Caleb stepped inside. Bruno entered slowly behind him, nails clicking against the wooden floorboards. The dog immediately froze near the far wall beneath a framed painting of an old harbor crowded with fishing boats. His nose lifted toward the air. Then came the low rumble in his chest again. Caleb noticed Walter watching the shepherd carefully. Not nervous. Almost resigned. "He hears it too," Walter murmured softly. Caleb removed his damp coat and glanced around the cottage. The room looked less like a home and more like a memory someone refused to let disappear. Old brass compasses sat beside shelves filled with tied journals and faded nautical maps. Black and white photographs lined the mantel above the fireplace. Fishermen smiling beside giant tuna catches. Children running across docks long since gone. Harbor festivals beneath strings of lights. Yet one photograph near the center caught Caleb's attention immediately. It showed a harbor far larger than modern Blackwater. Rows of boats stretched across a massive marina beneath a tall lighthouse painted white instead of the dark rusted tower standing outside town today. The image looked alive with people and light. Walter noticed Caleb staring. "That was Blackwater Harbor before the storm of 1966, he said quietly while placing a kettle on the stove. "Before half the town vanished." Caleb frowned. "The harbor was that large?" Walter gave a slow nod. "Bigger than Portland back then. Fishing fleets came from all over New England." Bruno stepped closer to the photograph and suddenly pressed one paw against the floorboards beneath it. Scratch. 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 Caleb crouched beside him. The wood sounded hollow. Walter's expression changed instantly. The old fisherman set down the kettle without speaking. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the lantern flame flickered with the draft rolling in from the sea cliffs. Bruno scratched again, more urgently this time. Caleb ran his hand across the floor and felt something strange beneath the wood. A faint vibration. Rhythmic. Almost like distant machinery turning somewhere underground. Walter slowly lowered himself into a chair near the fireplace, his pale blue eyes fixed on the floor beneath the dog. "For 60 years, he whispered, that sound only returned during storms." Another deep bell rolled across the harbor outside. Closer this time. The cottage windows rattled softly. Bruno stiffened. Then the old lighthouse beyond the cliffs suddenly flashed once through the fog even though everyone in Blackwater knew its light had been dead for decades. The flash from the lighthouse vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving only fog and darkness pressed against the cottage windows. Caleb stood motionless beside the fireplace while the kettle hissed softly on the stove behind him. For several seconds nobody spoke. Even the ocean below the cliffs seemed to hold its breath. Then Bruno moved. The shepherd backed away from the wall slowly, ears pinned halfway down, eyes fixed toward the north where the old lighthouse stood hidden somewhere beyond the mist. Caleb had seen that posture before during his deployment overseas. It was the look Bruno carried whenever he sensed something unfamiliar beneath the surface of silence. Walter finally rose from his chair with visible effort. And walked toward the window overlooking the sea. His reflection trembled faintly against the glass beside the glow of the lantern light. "It has not shined since the winter storm," he whispered. "Not once in 60 years. Rain drifted across the cliffs outside in silver threads while waves rolled through the darkness below like distant thunder softened by time." Caleb stepped beside the old fisherman and looked toward the harbor. Nothing was visible now except fog swallowing the shoreline. "You said half the town vanished," Caleb said quietly. Walter nodded slowly. The storm came without warning in November of 1966. Winds stronger than any hurricane they had recorded along this coast. Boats snapped loose from their moorings. Entire streets flooded before sunrise. People said the sea sounded wrong that night. He paused, staring toward the darkness beyond the cliffs. Then the harbor disappeared. Caleb frowned slightly. Storms do not erase entire harbors. Walter gave a tired smile that carried no humor. "No. They do not." Bruno suddenly crossed the room again and stopped beside an old wooden cabinet near the staircase. His nose pressed against the crack beneath its doors. Then came another low growl vibrating deep in his chest. Caleb opened the cabinet carefully. Inside sat stacks of tied journals bound with cracked leather straps, several rusted lanterns, and a long brass telescope stained green by salt air. Beneath them rested a folded nautical map tied with faded blue ribbon. Walter's face tightened the moment he saw it. "I was hoping he would not find that tonight," he murmured. Caleb untied the ribbon carefully and unfolded the map across the kitchen table beneath the lantern glow. The parchment smelled faintly of mildew and seawater. Blackwater Harbor was drawn across the center in careful ink lines, but farther north beyond the modern shoreline sat another harbor entirely. Larger. Hidden within the cliffs. Dockyards. Warehouses. Fuel depots. A massive circular marina protected by natural rock walls. At the center stood the lighthouse. Caleb stared at it silently. "This place is not on any map now." Walter slowly shook his head. "Because officially it never existed." Outside, the wind rose sharply against the cottage walls. The lantern flickered. Somewhere beneath the floorboards came the faint vibration again. Rhythmic. Metallic. Like machinery turning deep underground. Bruno lifted his head instantly toward the sound. Walter closed his eyes. "Every storm brings it closer." Caleb looked down at the map once more and noticed writing near the harbor entrance almost hidden beneath water stains. "Property sealed under federal order. November 17, 1966. No access permitted." Caleb felt the same cold tension he used to feel before discovering something buried overseas that somebody powerful never intended to be uncovered. "What happened there?" he asked softly. Walter did not answer immediately. Instead he reached toward the fireplace mantel and picked up a small brass key hanging beside the old photographs. Its surface had darkened with age, but engraved across the top was a symbol matching the lighthouse drawn on the map. The old fisherman turned the key slowly in his hand while rain whispered against the roof overhead. "There are places," he said quietly, "where grief settles into the walls so deeply that even time becomes afraid to disturb them." Then another bell rolled across the harbor outside. Louder now. Closer than before. And somewhere beyond the fog, hidden in the darkness north of town, the lighthouse flashed again. The storm finally weakened near dawn, but the fog remained draped over Blackwater Bay like a heavy curtain that refused to rise. Pale gray morning light slipped through the cottage windows, touching the old photographs and tied journals with a cold silver glow while the sea below the cliffs rolled in slow restless swells against the rocks. Caleb had not slept. He sat at the kitchen table studying the hidden harbor map while Bruno lay near the fireplace with his head lifted alertly toward the floor every few minutes. Whatever vibration moved beneath the cottage during the night had not completely vanished. It came and went like the pulse of some enormous sleeping machine buried deep beneath the coastline. Walter Hale stood quietly at the stove pouring black coffee into chipped ceramic mugs. The old fisherman looked older in daylight somehow, as if the storm had peeled years of strength from his shoulders during the night. Yet there was something else in his face too. Relief. The kind carried by someone who had spent decades waiting for a burden to finally surface. Caleb traced the faded lines of the map carefully. If this harbor was sealed by the government, he said quietly, why keep the records hidden all these years? Walter stared into his coffee for several seconds before answering. Because the wrong people died there. Outside, gulls cried somewhere beyond the fog, their voices drifting faintly through the damp morning air. Walter carried his mug toward the window overlooking the sea cliffs. Most people remember the storm because of the flooding, he continued softly. But that was not what frightened the men who survived it. Caleb looked up. Walter's pale blue eyes remained fixed on the ocean below. 3 Coast Guard ships disappeared that night. No wreckage. No distress calls. Nothing. The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fireplace and the soft ticking of rainwater dripping from the porch roof outside. Bruno suddenly rose to his feet. His ears sharpened toward the north side of the cottage. Then came 3 slow scratches at the front door. Caleb frowned instantly and reached for the handle, but the moment he opened it the porch stood completely empty. Only fog drifted across the cliffs beyond the railing. Yet Bruno moved forward immediately, nose lifted toward the sea breeze. Caleb stepped outside. The air smelled sharply of salt and wet cedar. Somewhere below the cliffs waves folded against stone with the deep hollow sound of distant drums. Then Caleb noticed the footprints. Fresh boot prints crossing the wet porch boards. One set only. They appeared from the fog near the cliff path and ended directly at the front door. No returning tracks. Caleb felt a slow chill settle across the back of his neck. Walter stepped outside behind him and stared down at the prints without surprise. It started again earlier this week, he murmured. After the first winter storm rolled in. Caleb looked toward him carefully. What started? The old fisherman hesitated. The harbor trying to be found. A gust of wind swept across the cliffs hard enough to rattle the porch lantern overhead. Far out beyond the fog came another bell. Deeper now. Closer than before. Bruno suddenly bolted off the porch toward the narrow trail leading north along the cliffs. Bruno! Caleb shouted, already running after him. The shepherd raced through the mist with focused urgency, paws splashing through puddles along the rocky path while cedar branches whipped softly in the wind overhead. Walter followed more slowly behind, gripping the brass key tightly in one weathered hand. The trail curved sharply around the cliffs until the old lighthouse finally emerged through the fog ahead. Up close it looked even older than Caleb imagined. Rust streaked its stone walls. Windows stood cracked and dark. Salt grass grew through broken concrete around the base. Yet high above them, the dead lantern room glowed faintly gold behind the mist. Bruno circled the lighthouse once before stopping near a patch of thick ivy clinging to the cliffside beside the tower. Then he barked 3 times and pawed violently at the vines. Caleb moved closer and froze. Hidden beneath the ivy sat a steel door built directly into the rock wall. Its rusted surface carried the same symbol engraved on Walter's brass key. The steel door looked older than the lighthouse itself, its surface scarred by decades of salt wind and winter storms. Rust curled around the hinges like dried blood beneath the pale morning fog, while seawater dripped steadily from cracks in the cliff above. Bruno stood directly before it, body rigid and alert, amber eyes fixed on the narrow seam where the metal disappeared into the stone. The shepherd let out another low growl that vibrated deep in his chest. Caleb stepped closer and brushed away wet ivy from the center of the door. Beneath the moss and corrosion sat the same symbol carved into Walter's brass key. A lighthouse surrounded by waves. Walter finally reached them, breathing hard from the climb along the cliffs. For several moments the old fisherman simply stared at the hidden entrance without speaking. His weathered face carried the look of a man standing before a grave he had spent half a lifetime trying not to revisit. The wind shifted suddenly around the lighthouse, carrying the sharp scent of seawater and something older beneath it. Oil. Machinery. Metal long buried underground. Caleb noticed it immediately. Bruno did too. The dog's ears snapped higher. This place was sealed after the storm, Walter said quietly, his voice almost swallowed by the fog. Nobody was ever supposed to open it again. Caleb studied the heavy lock built into the door. Then why keep the key? Walter's pale blue eyes drifted toward the sea beyond the cliffs. Because sometimes the world waits for the right person before it gives its secrets back. Another bell echoed across the harbor below. Closer now. The sound rolled through the fog with a strange hollow depth that did not belong to any ordinary ship. Bruno barked sharply once and stepped back from the door. Walter slowly lifted the brass key with trembling fingers. The old metal slid into the lock with surprising ease despite 60 years of silence. For a moment nothing happened. Then came a deep mechanical click from somewhere inside the cliff. The ground beneath their feet vibrated faintly. Dust drifted from the stone overhead. Caleb exchanged a glance with Walter before gripping the edge of the steel door. It resisted at first. Then with a long groan the entrance slowly opened inward, releasing a rush of cold air that smelled of seawater, engine grease, and forgotten time. Darkness stretched beyond the doorway. A narrow tunnel carved directly into the rock disappeared beneath the lighthouse, its damp walls lined with rusted pipes and old electrical cables. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling into shallow puddles shimmering beneath Caleb's flashlight beam. Bruno moved forward first without hesitation, paws clicking softly against the concrete floor. The shepherd paused every few feet to listen before continuing deeper underground. Walter followed more slowly behind, one hand resting against the wall for balance while memories seemed to weigh heavier with each step downward. The tunnel sloped gradually beneath the cliffs. Somewhere far ahead came the faint hum of machinery still running after all these years. Caleb felt the hair rise slightly along the back of his neck. "How is there still power here?" he asked quietly. Walter gave a weary smile. "That is the question nobody could ever answer." They walked for several minutes through the cold underground passage while the sound of the ocean faded behind them. Then the tunnel widened suddenly into darkness so vast Caleb stopped walking entirely. His flashlight beam swept forward and revealed water. Massive black water stretching across an underground harbor hidden beneath the cliffs. Caleb's breath caught silently. Boats rested motionless along ancient docks below enormous stone walls dripping with moisture. Fishing trawlers. Tugboats. Supply vessels. Every one preserved like ghosts frozen in another century beneath layers of dust and salt. Dim industrial lamps hanging high overhead flickered weakly against the cavern's ceiling, somehow still alive after decades underground. Wooden warehouses lined the marina untouched by time. Nets still hung beside loading cranes. Fuel barrels remained stacked along the docks exactly where workers had left them 60 years earlier. Bruno slowly stepped toward the edge of the underground pier, ears high, eyes reflecting the pale lights shimmering across the still black water. Then somewhere deeper within the hidden harbor came the slow sound of footsteps echoing through the cavern even though no one else should have been there. The footsteps echoed again through the underground harbor, slow and uneven, carrying across the still black water with the hollow rhythm of someone walking through another lifetime. Caleb instinctively lowered his flashlight beam while Bruno moved closer to the edge of the pier, body tense but strangely calm. The shepherd did not bark this time. He simply listened. The enormous cavern stretched around them like a forgotten world hidden beneath the cliffs of Blackwater Bay. Overhead, ancient industrial lights flickered weakly against the stone ceiling, casting long reflections across the silent marina below. Dust floated through the air untouched for decades. Somewhere deeper in the cavern, water dripped steadily into the harbor with the soft ticking sound of time itself refusing to stop completely. Walter Hale stood motionless beside Caleb, staring into the darkness ahead with pale eyes filled by memories too heavy to carry alone any longer. "There used to be hundreds of men working down here," he whispered. "Fishermen. Engineers. Coast Guard crews. Families." His voice faded softly against the cavern walls. You could hear music from the dock restaurants every Saturday night. Caleb swept his flashlight slowly across the nearest boat. The vessel looked ready to sail despite the thick layer of salt covering its railings. Ropes remained neatly coiled beside the deck. Rusted coffee mugs still sat inside the wheelhouse windows. It looked less abandoned and paused, as if everyone had stepped away for only a moment 60 years ago. Then Bruno suddenly lifted his head toward the far side of the harbor. Another footstep echoed. Closer now. Caleb narrowed his eyes toward a row of dark warehouses lining the marina. A faint golden light flickered between them. Not electric. Lantern light. Walter inhaled sharply beside him. That cannot be possible. Caleb looked toward the old fisherman carefully. You know this place better than you have admitted. Walter remained silent for several seconds while the lantern glow drifted slowly through the shadows ahead. Finally he nodded. My father helped build this harbor during the war. Caleb frowned slightly. Walter's weathered hands tightened around the brass key. The government needed a hidden port where damaged rescue ships could disappear without enemy satellites spotting them. Supply vessels came through here carrying survivors from naval accidents along the Atlantic. Everything below Blackwater was classified. His voice trembled faintly. Most of the town never even knew this harbor existed beneath their feet. The underground lights flickered again overhead. For a brief moment the cavern darkened almost completely before the weak glow returned. Bruno moved closer to Caleb's side and let out a low uneasy rumble. Walter stared across the water toward the northern docks where the lantern light had vanished. The storm of 1966 did not destroy this place, he said quietly. It sealed it. Caleb looked at him sharply. Walter's eyes remained fixed on the black water. One of the rescue ships returned carrying something the government never wanted discovered. The distant bell echoed again through the cavern. Deep. Hollow. Close enough now that the sound vibrated faintly through the dock beneath their boots. Walter's face tightened. The storm came the same night officials ordered everyone evacuated. Workers were forced out before sunrise. Some never made it back to the surface. A cold draft moved through the underground marina carrying the scent of oil, seawater, and old machinery still humming somewhere beneath the cliffs. Caleb glanced toward the warehouse district again. And after that? Walter gave a tired smile filled with grief. After that, Blackwater Harbor officially stopped existing. Bruno suddenly barked once toward the far end of the cavern. Caleb turned instantly. The lantern light had returned. This time standing perfectly still beside one of the old warehouses. A figure stood there holding it. Tall. Motionless. Barely visible through the darkness and drifting mist rising from the harbor water. Caleb took one slow step forward, but before he could speak, the figure raised one arm and pointed toward a massive steel building near the edge of the marina. Across its rusted doors, faded white letters still remained visible beneath decades of dust. Pier Control Station 7. Then the lantern went out. The darkness where the lantern figure had stood remained completely still after the light vanished, yet the feeling of being watched lingered across the underground harbor like cold mist drifting over deep water. Caleb kept his flashlight aimed toward Pier Control Station 7 while Bruno stood rigid beside him, ears high, amber eyes fixed on the massive steel building across the marina. The old shepherd's breathing slowed into the controlled rhythm Caleb remembered from dangerous search operations overseas. Bruno was listening again. Somewhere inside the cavern, machinery hummed softly beneath layers of stone and seawater. Walter Hale stared toward the abandoned control station with an expression caught between fear and sorrow. Nobody has stepped inside that building since the evacuation, he whispered. Not officially. The faint industrial lights hanging overhead flickered once more, their reflections trembling across the black harbor water below. Caleb moved forward slowly along the dock while damp air curled through the marina carrying the smell of rust, engine oil, and ancient cedar soaked by decades of salt. Every step echoed through the cavern with hollow weight. Fishing nets swayed softly from hooks overhead despite the still air, and somewhere deeper underground came the slow groan of old metal shifting against stone. The harbor felt alive in a strange quiet way, as though it had spent 60 years asleep and was only now beginning to breathe again. Bruno suddenly stopped near a rusted loading crane and lowered his nose toward the dock planks. Caleb crouched beside him. Fresh water glistened across the wood in the shape of footprints leading toward the control station. Not dusty. Not old. Fresh. Walter saw them too and slowly removed his cap, running one weathered hand across his white hair. That should not be possible, he murmured. Caleb followed the footprints carefully toward the steel building looming beside the marina. Faded windows lined its upper floor while rust streaked down concrete walls scarred by moisture and time. Yet near the entrance, one small exterior lamp glowed faintly amber above the doorway. Caleb reached the heavy steel doors first. One side stood slightly open. Bruno moved ahead immediately into the darkness beyond. Inside, the air felt warmer. Old generators hummed somewhere below the floor while rows of dusty control panels blinked weakly with dim green lights still operating after all these years. Maritime radios lined the walls beside water-stained maps and faded emergency notices from another century. Coffee cups remained scattered across desks exactly where workers had abandoned them decades earlier. Caleb swept his flashlight slowly across the room until the beam stopped on a large bulletin board near the far wall. Photographs covered it from top to bottom. Rescue crews. Coast Guard teams. Harbor workers. Families smiling beside ships. But at the center hung one black and white photograph larger than all the others. Caleb stepped closer. The picture showed a much younger Walter Hale standing beside another man in a naval officer's coat. Between them stood a teenage boy no older than 16 wearing a lighthouse keeper's jacket. Caleb glanced toward Walter. The old fisherman's eyes softened painfully. "My son," he whispered. Silence filled the control station except for the faint crackle of old electrical lines hidden inside the walls. Walter walked slowly toward the photograph, fingertips trembling slightly as they touched the edge of the frame. "Elias worked the lighthouse with me after school," he said quietly. He knew every tide current better than most captains. His voice weakened beneath the weight of memory. The night of the storm, he stayed behind to guide the rescue ships through the fog. Bruno suddenly growled low near the back corner of the room. Caleb turned instantly. A small radio unit sitting alone on one desk had come alive with static. The speaker crackled softly before a faint voice emerged through the interference. Broken. Distant. Almost swallowed by ocean noise. "Control Station 7, respond." Walter froze completely. The color drained from his face. The radio crackled again. "Harbor entrance sealed, lighthouse still active." Then through the static came one final sentence spoken by a young male voice trembling against the sound of roaring wind and crashing water. "Dad, do not let them bury this place." The transmission cut out instantly. The room fell silent again except for the weak hum of electricity and the sound of Walter Hale quietly breaking apart beneath 60 years of grief. The radio room remained silent long after the transmission faded into static, yet the young voice seemed to linger inside the walls of Control Station 7 like an echo trapped beneath decades of stone and seawater. Walter Hale stood motionless beside the old bulletin board, his weathered hand trembling against the photograph of his son while dim green lights blinked weakly across the abandoned control panels around them. Caleb did not speak. Some grief carried a shape too sacred for words. Bruno slowly crossed the room and rested beside Walter's chair, pressing his head gently against the old fisherman's leg as if the shepherd understood sorrow better than most people ever could. Outside the control station windows, pale morning light had finally begun filtering through the fog above the underground harbor. The black water shimmered softly beneath the cavern lights while ancient fishing boats rested silently along the marina docks like forgotten memories waiting for someone to remember their names again. Walter finally drew a slow breath. Elias stayed behind to keep the harbor lights running while the evacuation happened, he whispered. The government believed enemy submarines had discovered this place during the war. They ordered the harbor sealed permanently after the storm damaged the tunnels. His pale eyes drifted toward the silent marina beyond the windows. But my son refused to let them bury the people who built this harbor. Caleb looked toward the old radio equipment lining the walls. That transmission sounded recent. Walter nodded faintly. The generators beneath the cliffs never stopped running. Sometimes during storms the radios wake up again. He gave a tired smile touched by sadness and wonder. Maybe places filled with enough love never truly go silent. Bruno suddenly lifted his head toward the harbor entrance tunnel. Footsteps echoed faintly through the marina again. Slow. Familiar. Caleb turned sharply, but this time he saw no figure carrying a lantern. Instead, sunlight had begun pouring through cracks high above the cavern ceiling where stormwater spilled down the rock walls like silver curtains. The underground harbor no longer felt haunted. It felt remembered. Walter carefully reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded stack of documents sealed inside waterproof canvas. He placed them gently on the desk before Caleb. Property deeds. Harbor ownership papers. Original engineering records bearing the Hale family name across every page. Caleb stared at them silently. Walter, the old fisherman raised one weathered hand softly. There is nobody left now except me. His voice carried no bitterness. Only peace. And I do not think this harbor called you here by accident. Caleb glanced toward Bruno. The shepherd stood near the windows overlooking the marina, tail still, ears relaxed for the first time since entering the cavern. Walter smiled faintly at the dog. Animals know when a place still has a soul. The underground bell echoed one final time through the cavern. Not mournful now. Gentle. Almost welcoming. Walter slowly pressed the brass lighthouse key into Caleb's hand. Blackwater Harbor belongs to you now. Caleb looked stunned. I cannot take this. Yes, Walter said quietly. You can. His pale blue eyes reflected the marina lights shimmering across the water below. You arrived with nothing except loyalty and kindness. That is how this harbor was built the first time. Silence settled softly around them while the cavern breathed with the slow hum of old machinery still alive beneath the cliffs. Months later, the people of Blackwater Bay would gather along the shoreline beneath a cold autumn sunset to watch something they never believed they would see again. Lights glowing across the northern cliffs. The old lighthouse shining over the sea once more. Fishing boats returning slowly through the restored harbor channel while gulls circled overhead in the golden evening air. Children would run along repaired docks where silence had ruled for 60 years. Music would drift once again from waterfront cafes reopened beneath strings of warm lantern light. And high above the harbor, Caleb Mercer would stand beside Bruno on the lighthouse balcony watching the ocean stretch endlessly beyond the fog. The wind carried the scent of salt, cedar, and distant rain while waves rolled softly against the cliffs below like the heartbeat of something ancient finally at peace. Then somewhere far out across the water came one final ship